Hi, Sci-Fi Feminists. Thank you for attending my presentation. My name is Colette Fair, and this is part of Gendered Labor. I'm going to be talking about Charlotte Perkins-Gilman and applying her work to women in international development. I did a reading from my short novel, Nightmare in Silicon, prior to this, streamed right before this, but the video should still be available if you're interested in cyber-feminist, cyberpunk, about a woman getting turned into a gender-neutral robot who can't dream. So that's that book. So I wrote this paper actually years ago in school, but I thought it would be something that would be fitting for this conference to just kind of remind us of the importance of feminist science fiction, and ideals sort of over material reality. So I'll be getting into that more, but I don't know that I think of myself as an academic, but I have a bachelor's in political science from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a master's in market research and consumer behavior from the Instituto de Empresa, also known as IE in Madrid. So yeah, I'm going to be sharing my screen for most of this, but yeah, and please, if you're interested in reading the actual paper, I'm going to put it up on my website at colettefair.com. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Colette Fair. So let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen. And so here we are. So it's entitled Where Progress Ends, Charlotte Perkins-Gilman's Suspension of Belief and Its Implications for Women in Development. And yeah, so first to just explain Charlotte Perkins-Gilman's contributions a little bit. She is was both a fiction and a nonfiction writer in the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. And when her mother came to her, she was 13, she actually insisted that she give up this rich fantasy life that she had had up until that time, writings, dreams, really enriched inner world that, I think a lot of people who write or read fiction can understand. As Gilman put it, to close off the L and live in the main building, to hold the door shut on happiness and keep it shut. But the modern feminisms movements, plural, owe a debt of gratitude to her reopening that door and sort of, she did focus a lot on science in her work, as we'll see, but she also kept her idealism as well. And I'm going to be talking about two books here, Herland and Women in Economics, and comparing them. They're actually very similar works, even though one is a novel and one is a nonfiction work. So Herland was a 1915 feminist utopian novel about an all-female planet that 3 male explorers come and very colonially discover and observe and end up getting into romantic relationships with a few of the women on this planet, and much hijinks ensue. Women in Economics viewed feminism as a cure for the economic problems of the time. It was sort of Gilman's response to an argument that as society advanced, women became more oppressed, which is sort of, I was surprised to hear that at the time because it felt a little like the opposite of what we maybe like to think nowadays, that certainly from like a cyber feminist or like just a general development like lens, that women can benefit from the development of society. I do want to talk a little about terms and just be really accessible, and I'm not sure who my audience is, but when I talk about development, we often think of international development. So international economic development, but also societal. And we often think of developing nations in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and other areas, which maybe have a lower GDP and that kind of thing. Gilman actually was writing for a largely American audience, so how to develop the United States. And we could argue that even today, the United States is in a lot of ways a developing nation in need of improvement. President Truman, sort of formation of the term development was criticized by, for example, Arturo Escobar, saying that it was imperialist, like we're just going to go into these other less privileged nations and try to remake them in our image and brand them with the Coca-Cola logo, and as long as their GDP goes up, it's fine. And I think we've also seen in modern international development that just because GDP goes up doesn't mean that the people on the ground are benefiting from it. So there's a lot of sort of negative sides to international development and trying to go and improve conditions in other nations that we're not familiar with. But Gilman had a very specific view of development. Again, she had a lot of American references to the United States in her work, culturally, and the terms that she used. She used a lot of science and actually biology, which is very interesting because she would talk about like insects and like asexual breeding of insects and like animal behavior, and then all of a sudden she would apply it to human society. So it was very interesting. The dark side of that, her sort of development, is that there were racist undertones. She seems to be a proponent of eugenics. So I'm definitely reading with a critical eye there, but that in a sense kind of supports the argument that I'm going to make, just kind of the limits of materialist thinking and the view of physicality being more important than anything else. To define materialist feminism, so materialism is the idea that physical reality is what's sort of most important at the heart of how societies are formed, how history happens. It's not because of ideals, materialists think, it's because of the confines of physical and material, including financial realities. So materialist feminism takes from this, and also is similar to Marxist feminism, and some people don't think there's a lot of difference between those two substrains of feminism, but basically it views women's economic sort of oppression within capitalism via our bodies. So like if we're doing household labor that we're not paid for fairly, or if just giving birth, eggs, milk, those kinds of things viewed as like commodities within capitalism. So a view of like the very physical, again, physical realities of life in society. And again, Gilman's development. So she was definitely a socialist, a feminist. She talked about contributions to society as a whole. She, was in favor of collective childcare and those kinds of things. But she spoke a great deal of science, right, and biology, and the idea that feminism was almost based upon science in a way. So that's interesting, is something that I view a little bit critically, like, do we need science to prove that we should be feminists? Again, with a lot of her references to like eugenics terms of the time, which is very quaint and strange to us now, like race preservation and improvement to the human species and weird things like that. And then she had different than like our idea of sustainable development today. She viewed development as very in sync with nature, not just simply trying to reduce the amount of development or the factory spewing pollution in order to preserve nature, but like, for example, in Herland, she spoke of the female residents of the all-female planet replanting an entire forest with trees that bore fruit rather than just, say, oaks that had less nutritional value. So for her, that's development. So it's very in line with nature. And she didn't feel that, you know, utopia was even an endpoint, that development was something that was always going to continue, and we should continue to improve and develop society. So comparing Herland and Women in Economics is very uncanny. Some of the differences, or rather some of the similarities that you'll see between these two books. I happen to open to the same page on both one of the editions of, I think, Women in Economics, page 102, and I found, so when I looked at Women in Economics, Gilman said, and she was very into sweeping generalizations, but she said, the duty of human life is progress, development. If you turn to the same page in the 1979 edition of Herland, we find that life, for the women of Herland, life to them was growth, their pleasure was in growing, and their duty also. So Gilman believes we have a duty to develop and progress as a society. And yeah, again, and not even Utopia represents that endpoint. Herland is in a lot of ways basically a fictional version of Women in Economics, and it was written that pretty much all of her fictional work was like an attempt to fictionalize women in economics. And she lived at the end of an era when, in Victorian era, when the purpose of fiction was not to entertain, but to convey a moral. And you can hear that in some of the writing. It comes off as, at times, moralistic or not like quite as entertaining or fast-paced as what we're used to today, but still very interesting and worth taking a look at. In Herland, so a bit of a spoiler, but there is a rape that takes place, and it's a very important plot point that is sort of how the book comes to its ending. And basically, so let me back up. So Herland kind of revolves around motherhood. They basically, the only women that don't procreate on this planet are those of inferior breeding. So again, you can see sort of eugenics undertones even here. But the main character, Elidor, and her male partner, one of these explorers, are starting a relationship, and she doesn't feel comfortable having sex with him, quote, without regard to motherhood, until she knows that that is right. So even their sexual relations are all planned around children, and it's said that something like the only duty, or the most important duty to these women, was motherhood, to the point where there almost were no other duties. And when he decides to have sex with her, and it was kind of groundbreaking, because even at the time, Western laws didn't recognize rape within marriage as actual rape. So this was 1915. But basically, they had said in the book, like, the reason why it was such a problem was because they didn't know what kind of child is going to result from this. Part of that has to do with like this weird eugenics breeding theme that we see. So it says in Herland, quote, they seem to measure the enormity of the offense by its effect upon a possible fatherhood. So even in this case, the illegality of rape is based upon the effects it would have on children, not women themselves. So rather than having an inborn right to protection against sexual violence, in a sense, we're kind of earning it through our contribution to children. That's something that I question. And in Women in Economics as well, there's an argument throughout that women's liberation is what is going to benefit society economically. And she makes that argument. And certainly in a culture where men have most of the power and are the ones that are making these decisions, it's understandable why you would use these kinds of arguments to, if they're not concerned about feminism and these ideals to begin with, they're more concerned about money. Maybe that's like a selling point. But my thing is, I think we should be a little more careful about how what arguments we use to maybe prove our rights. So I was reminded of, and this was an old study in the time that I had been writing it, the United Nations Population Fund study And there have been other studies like this showing that women's education was the highest contributing factor to improved childhood nutrition in developing countries. And I believe this was a cross-country study. But even in 2020, there was a study in India basically saying the same thing, that when women get an education, their kids experience improved nutrition. That's great, but that's another one of these arguments that is based on economics, rather than the idea that women should be respected, should have these rights regardless of the sort of economic contributions or the contributions that they have to children, that they should be able to be seen, of course, outside of a role of motherhood as well. These kinds of studies are very at odds with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or similar documentation that says that our rights are inborn and we should simply be all respected to live life free from violence and be able to get an education, etc. It's not something that needs to be proven. So to return to this idea of dreams and dreamland and ideals, this is where that kind of stuff can be more important than data and science and proving feminism, in a sense. Should we have to earn the privilege of being treated like human beings or being treated the same as men or other genders? Should we, or should we simply return, in a sense, to this moral stance, which is what I argue, that rights are something that you can't prove. You have to claim them yourself, and it is a really emotional and moral issue. You know, rights were the stuff of Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers, and that's where the connection for me comes in with fiction and writing and these ideals. You know, those of us writing feminist science fiction and reading it, we are part of that world that's kind of you know, separate from our everyday reality, and that is something that these narratives that we create and we read and we take part in are showing people the world the way that it can be, not simply just the way that it already is. We're not just being constrained by material reality, economic reality, and when the studies change, we hopefully won't have to just rescind our rights, because we'll have some sort of emotional and idealistic basis for that. So that's what I think about that. I have 2 more slides that I just had to include because they're adorable, and they were like in my Canva templates. It just was like, do dreams come true? Some dreams actually are true. So that's kind of just like the theme that I've been talking about, that yeah, I think you get it. And for inspiration, a penis person quote: today's science fiction is tomorrow's science fact. So again, just the connection between you know, the physical world and science, and the stories that, you know, we tell ourselves and allow ourselves to believe in. So that's me. I hope to see you in the Q&A, but please, you know, if you want to check out, again, this paper, or I have other nonfiction essays and also fiction writings on my site at colettefair.com. And you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram at colettefair. I'm also on Amazon and Goodreads as well. So I will hopefully connect with you soon. Thank you so much for watching.